Lieutenant Carter snatched her mission file and dropped it on the table like it was garbage. "Send her back," he said, not even looking at her. "I don't babysit." The room went silent. Claire Bennett stood 5 feet away, her rifle case at her side, and said nothing. She had heard worse. But the man in front of her had never seen what she could do, and before this mission ended, he would have no choice but to remember her name for the rest of his life. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The aircraft touched down at 0430 hours, and the heat was already there waiting, dry, relentless. The kind of heat that doesn't care who you are or what you've survived. The forward operating base sat at the edge of the southern Arizona desert, a temporary collection of tense vehicles and hard-faced men who had been running special operations missions for years. There were no decorations here, no comfort, just mission discipline and the unspoken understanding that every person at this base had earned the right to stand on this ground, or so they believed. The C-130 transport rolled to a stop on the short desert airstrip, and the rear ramp dropped with a mechanical groan. Most of the cargo that came off a plane like this was weapons, ammunition, or resupply. Occasionally, it was personnel replacement specialists attached assets. What walked off this particular aircraft was something nobody at FOB Sandridge had expected. She was small. That was the first thing every single person noticed, and there was no way to pretend otherwise. Specialist Claire Bennett stood 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds with her gear on. She was 29 years old, and in another life, in another world, she might have been someone's quiet neighbor, someone you passed in a grocery store without a second glance. She had dark hair pulled back tight under her patrol cap, sharp eyes the color of deep water, and a calm expression that didn't move when she stepped into the Arizona heat and felt the stares begin. She carried a Chaytak M200 intervention long-range sniper rifle in a hard case strapped to her back. The case was nearly as long as she was tall. Behind her, 2 additional duffel bags of specialized equipment hit the tarmac. Nobody moved to help her. That was fine. She didn't need anyone to move. The first voice came from somewhere to the left. One of the SEAL operators, a big man, 6'2", built like something that had been designed specifically to break things, leaned toward the man beside him and spoke just loud enough for half the flight line to hear. "You see that? Did command send us a soldier or a mascot?" A few laughs. Not everyone laughed, but enough. Another operator, younger, not quite as sure of himself, looked at the case on her back. "That rifle is bigger than she is. You think she's ever actually fired it, or is it just for show?" More laughter. Claire walked through it, not around it, through it. She picked up her second duffel, adjusted the case on her back, and moved toward the operations tent without breaking stride and without a single word. Her face didn't change. Her pace didn't slow. She had learned a long time ago that engaging with that kind of noise was a waste of energy, and she did not waste energy. Inside the operations tent, Lieutenant Mason Carter was standing over a large mission planning table covered with topographic maps, satellite imagery, and printed intelligence reports. He was 38 years old, a 15-year veteran of the naval special warfare community, a man who had run operations in environments that would have ended most people's careers before they began. He was respected, and he had earned that respect through countless operations in the kind of places most Americans never saw on a map. I was also the kind of man who formed opinions quickly and defended them stubbornly. He looked up when Claire entered. He looked down at the mission binder in his hand. He looked back up. "Specialist Bennett," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement, like reading a name off a wrong order. "Sir," she replied. He set the binder down and crossed his arms. "I've read your file." He said it the way someone might say, "I've seen the magic trick, and I already know how it works." Sniper qualification, top of your class at the Special Operations Target Interdiction course. 2 years attached to a surveillance and reconnaissance unit in a forward deployed environment. He paused. "Impressive paperwork." "Thank you, sir." "I'm not done." He uncrossed his arms and moved around the table until he was standing directly in front of her. He was well over a foot taller. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they're trying to figure out. "Paperwork doesn't tell me how you perform when you're carrying 80 pounds through terrain that will break people twice your size. Paperwork doesn't tell me how you handle a long-range engagement when the environment stops cooperating. and paperwork definitely doesn't tell me what you do when things go wrong. Claire met his gaze. No, sir, it doesn't. So let me be direct with you, because I respect people enough to be honest. Carter stepped back and picked up the mission map. This operation runs through approximately 41 kilometers of some of the most difficult terrain in the Southwest. The primary objective involves a high-value target compound with significant defensive capability. We have limited air support, limited communication windows, and zero tolerance for anything that slows this team down or creates additional risk. He set the map down. You're not built for this mission. Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the kind that meant something was being decided. Claire looked at the map. She didn't look at Carter. She looked at the map and her eyes moved across it the way a reader moves through a familiar book quickly and with quiet understanding. Then she said, "With respect, sir, I would like to review the full route." Carter stared at her. "I just told you my assessment." "I heard your assessment, sir." She looked at him now. "I'm asking to review the route." Something crossed Carter's face, not quite anger, not quite surprise. It was the expression of a man who was used to being the last word in a room, being met with something that wasn't quite pushback, but wasn't agreement either. He stepped aside from the table. Claire moved to the map. She studied it for less than 90 seconds. In that time, she didn't speak. She traced the planned route with her eyes from the insertion point to the objective, then back out to the extraction zone. She noted the canyon. She noted the elevation on either side. She noted the narrow passage at the 3/4 mark of the route where the walls came in tight and the ground flattened. Then she spoke. "This canyon section," she said, pointing to the area without touching the map. "The walls on both sides reach approximately 80 meters in height. The floor is roughly 30 meters wide at the narrowest point. Any team moving through that passage loses left and right observation, which means ground-based overwatch is impossible. Air support requires line of sight. If the enemy has pre-positioned assets on those ridges, this route is a kill zone." Carter's expression didn't change. "We have pre-mission reconnaissance on the canyon. It's clear." "When was the last satellite pass a beat? Not long, but noticeable." 14 hours ago. 14 hours is a long time, sir. I'm aware of how time works, Specialist. I'm not questioning your awareness, sir. Claire kept her voice level and steady. I'm noting that 14 hours is enough time to move a significant amount of material and personnel into a prepared position, especially if someone knew our general area of operation in advance. The word hung in the air. Carter's jaw tightened. "Are you suggesting we have an intelligence breach?" "I'm suggesting that someone laid a trap," Claire said, "and the route as planned walks directly into it." For a long moment, the only sound in the operations tent was the hum of the portable generator outside. Carter looked at the map. He looked at Claire. He looked at the other team members who had quietly entered the tent during their conversation and were now standing along the wall watching. Then he said, "Stay behind the team. Don't become a problem we have to solve." He turned back to the map and the conversation was over. Claire stepped back from the table. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She picked up her equipment and walked toward the tent entrance. On her way out, she passed through the group of operators who had watched the entire exchange. Nobody said anything. Most of them looked away. One of them, the same big man from the flight line whose name she would later learn was Sergeant Dale Whitman, held her gaze for just a moment. She couldn't tell if there was respect in it yet, but there was something like a question that hadn't been asked yet. Outside, Claire found a quiet spot near the motor pool and sat down on a gear crate. She opened her mission folder gear and reviewed the route again in her mind. She did the math she always did: range, elevation, wind patterns, weather probability, visibility, windows. She had been doing this long enough that it happened automatically, like breathing. And then she saw it. She had to look at the aerial photograph twice before she was sure, because the resolution wasn't perfect, and the image was 14 hours old, and the light at the time of the pass had been low. But there, on the ridge above the canyon's narrowest point, fresh parallel lines in the desert sand. Tire tracks, not old tracks, not the kind made by desert wildlife or erosion. Deliberate, purpose-driven tracks, the kind left by heavy vehicles moving to a specific position and stopping. Someone had driven something heavy up to that ridge within the last day or two. And in the desert, heavy vehicles didn't go to ridges for sightseeing. Claire stared at the photograph for a long time. She thought about what she had said to Carter, and she thought about what Carter had said back, and she thought about the 41 kilometers of desert that lay between right now and the objective. She thought about the canyon. She thought about the walls. She thought about the men on her team who had laughed at her on the flight line, and she thought about the men who hadn't laughed, and she thought about whether any of that mattered when the only thing standing between them and a prepared ambush was the decision being made right now in that operations tent. She thought about following the order. She thought about what it meant to follow an order when you knew the order was wrong. And then she thought about her first instructor at the sniper course, a quiet, intense man named Corporal Reeves who had told her something during the third week of training when she was exhausted and doubting everything. The rifle doesn't care how big you are. The rifle only cares if you are right. Claire put the photograph back in the folder. She looked at the mountain ridge to the north, the one that sat at approximately 3,000 meters from the canyon center, the one that was steep, brutal, and completely unassigned in the mission plan, the one that would require a solo climb in difficult terrain, carrying a rifle that most people couldn't lift above their shoulders. She calculated the shot from that position. Then she calculated it again. Then she thought about the tire tracks on the ridge below and the 14-hour-old satellite imagery in Carter's voice when he said, "Stay behind the team." She sat there for 22 minutes. She made her decision. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no music, no lightning, no sudden surge of courage. She simply looked at the numbers, looked at the terrain, looked at the photographs, and accepted the truth of what she was going to have to do. Then she began preparing her equipment. Inside the operations tent, Carter was running the final mission brief. He walked the team through the route, the objective, the contingency plans, and the extraction windows. He was thorough and precise because he was always thorough and precise. What he didn't know was that in 40 minutes when the team moved out, Specialist Claire Bennett would be moving in a completely different direction. Not because she was reckless, not because she was disobeying for the sake of disobeying, but because she had seen the tire tracks, and she was the only one who had. The SEAL team assembled at the staging area before first light. 12 operators fully loaded, each carrying their specific assignment of weapons equipment, communication gear, and medical supplies. They were an impressive collection of human beings, experienced, capable, and conditioned for exactly this kind of environment. Claire was there. She stood at the rear of the formation, her CHATAC strapped to her back, her additional equipment in a specialized low-profile pack that she had spent the last several years learning to move with quietly and effectively. One of the operators near the front of the formation glanced back at her. It was a quick look, the kind people give when they want to assess something without being obvious about it. She saw it. She always saw everything. Another operator, a stocky man named Rodriguez, who seemed to be the kind of person who filled silence with sound, turned around and offered her a genuine enough smile. "You need anyone to spell you on that rifle? That thing looks like it weighs more than you do." "It weighs 31 pounds, Claire said. "Right," Rodriguez said. "And you weigh enough," Claire said. Rodriguez blinked, then he turned back around. The team moved out. The desert in the early hours before sunrise is a different world. The temperature drops enough to be almost bearable. The sky turns from black to deep purple at the edges, and the stars are so sharp and clear, they look like they were put there this morning. The only sounds are boots on rock and the occasional shifting of equipment and the steady rhythmic breathing of people who know how to pace themselves over long distances. Claire moved at the rear. She had made her calculations before the team left. She knew the moment she would need to break away. She knew the terrain feature she would use as her separation point. She knew approximately how long the climb would take, how much physical reserve she would need, and exactly what window she had before the team reached the canyon. What she didn't know was what she was going to find when she got to the top. She didn't think about that. She moved. At the 2-mile mark, the team stopped briefly for a route check. Carter moved efficiently through the group, confirming positions and progress. He passed Claire without speaking. She noticed he had looked at her equipment and looked away. She filed that away and kept her breathing even. At the 3-mile mark, they reached the terrain feature she had been watching for. A large, broken formation of red rock that jutted out from the desert floor in a way that created a natural blind from the direction the team was moving. From the team's perspective, it would look like Claire had simply moved behind the rocks for a moment. She did not come back out. She turned north. She began to climb. The mountain was not interested in being climbed. It pushed back with loose shale that slid underfoot, with walls of rock that required both hands, and offered no clear handholds, with the rifle on her back that shifted every time she reached for a new grip and reminded her that she was attempting something that would have been difficult for any soldier and was, by reasonable assessment, significantly harder for someone her size. She kept climbing. Her shoulders burned. The rifle case dug into her shoulder blades, where the straps had been adjusted to their tightest setting and still weren't quite right for her frame. She had learned to ignore that particular discomfort a long time ago. She focused on the next handhold, the next foothold, the angle of the slope, the distance remaining above her. At one point, a piece of shale gave way under her right foot, and she dropped almost a meter before her left hand caught a jutting rock edge and stopped her fall. She hung there for a moment, breathing. Her left hand was bleeding. She noted it, assessed it as non-critical, and kept climbing. Below her, though she couldn't see it, the SEAL team was 3.5 miles from the canyon entrance. She had approximately 2 hours, maybe less. And somewhere above her on a ridge she couldn't quite see from her current position, something was waiting. She climbed. An hour and 40 minutes into the ascent, the desert changed. Claire felt it before she saw it. The air pressure shifted slightly, the way it does when a large weather system is moving in quickly. She looked west and saw what she had feared she might see: a dark brown wall, the horizon high and wide and moving fast. The kind of wall that meant one thing in southern Arizona desert in summer. Sandstorm, a significant one. She checked her elevation. She was approximately 2/3 of the way up, close enough to see the ridge clearly now, and close enough to confirm what she had suspected from the aerial photograph. There were vehicles on that ridge. She could make out 2 of them, covered with camouflage netting to reduce their signature, but unmistakably present, and with the vehicles' figures moving with purpose and coordination, setting up what looked like crew-served weapons in positions that faced directly down into the canyon below. Everything she had told Carter was true. The ambush was real, and the team was walking into it. She pushed harder. The wind picked up as the storm's outer edge reached the mountain. Sand began moving horizontally, stinging against any exposed skin, reducing visibility incrementally. Claire pulled her goggles down and kept climbing, 1 foothold, 1 handhold, 1 meter at a time. She reached the summit with 22 minutes to spare. She dropped to her stomach immediately and crawled to the forward edge of the ridge, keeping her profile below the horizon line. She set up her rifle with practiced efficiency: bipod, tripod, rear rest, scope cover, remove chamber checked. She ranged the canyon floor, 3,050 meters. She ranged the enemy position on the lower ridge, the one that the enemy fighters were using for their ambush. 3,050 meters confirmed. In good conditions, with calm wind, in standard pressure, and full visibility. This was an extraordinary distance. It was near the outer edge of what the Chaytek M200 was designed for, and near the outer edge of what any human being could reliably achieve with it. The conditions were not good. The wind was now sustained at approximately 22 knots, with gusting to 35. The sandstorm had swallowed the lower desert entirely. Visibility in the canyon was close to zero. Claire looked through her scope. She could see the canyon through her thermal attachment, which cut through the dust, the way regular optics couldn't. She could see the heat signatures of the SEAL team moving through the canyon floor, unaware of how close they were to the prepared positions above them. She could see the enemy fighters getting into position, adjusting their weapons, coordinating through radio. She tried Carter. Static. She tried the team frequency. Static. The storm had killed communication completely. She was alone. She was the only person in the world right now who could see the full picture, the team below and the enemy above, and the distance between them measured not in meters, but in seconds. Claire pressed her cheek against the stock of the rifle. She breathed. She calculated. The wind at her position was measurable. The wind at intermediate range between her and the target was unknown, but she could estimate from the movement of dust clouds at various altitudes. The drop at this distance, with this round and this caliber, was significant, and she accounted for every millimeter of it. The temperature affected the powder burn. The altitude affected the trajectory. Every variable was a factor, and she worked through all of them in the space of approximately 45 seconds, because 45 seconds was all she had. Below her in the canyon, the SEAL team was reaching the kill zone. The enemy fighters were ready. The lead fighter was moving to the firing position of the crew-served weapon. Claire centered the reticle. She exhaled half her breath and held the remainder. She let the natural pause between heartbeats arrive. And somewhere deep in the part of her mind that was still the 29-year-old woman who had been laughed at on a flight line that morning, she thought about Carter's voice saying, "You are not built for this mission." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The round left the muzzle at approximately 2,900 feet per second and began its journey through 3,050 meters of turbulent, sand-choked desert air. Claire stayed on the scope. She counted. 3 seconds. 3.5. The lead fighter dropped. Claire was already adjusting for the second target. The SEAL team below in the canyon heard nothing. The storm had absorbed the shot completely. They were still moving, still unaware, still alive because of something they couldn't see or hear or understand yet. Claire moved to the second target. She breathed. She fired. And from a summit nobody had believed she could reach in conditions that made the shot nearly impossible in a rifle that the men on the flight line had joked was too heavy for her to carry, she began to bring them home. One impossible shot at a time. The second target dropped at 3,052 meters. Claire didn't watch him fall. She was already moving. Her right hand worked the bolt with a motion that had been practiced so many times it existed below conscious thought. Pull back, push forward, the brass case ejecting into the sand beside her, a fresh round chambering with a sound that the wind swallowed before it could travel an inch. She shifted her position 2 degrees to the left and found the third target through her thermal scope before the second man had finished falling. She fired. The third target dropped. She moved to the fourth. Down in the canyon, the SEAL team had no idea what was happening. They were moving through the kill zone, the narrowest point where the walls pressed in from both sides and the sky above them was a thin brown strip of storm-choked air. Their visibility was less than 30 meters. Their communication was dead. They were operating on instinct and training and the shared understanding that you keep moving because stopping in a kill zone is the last thing you ever do. Lieutenant Carter was at the front of the formation. He was watching the walls above him, watching the ground ahead, watching everything that his training told him to watch. And for the first time since the mission began, something was bothering him. Not fear. Carter had made peace with fear a long time ago, but something quieter than fear. Something that sat in the back of his mind and refused to leave. The canyon had been clear in the satellite pass 14 hours ago. He kept moving. Up on the summit, Claire was firing her 5th round. The enemy fighters on the lower ridge had not yet understood what was happening. The storm made the sound of the shots inaudible at their position. The first 3 men had gone down so fast and so quietly in the middle of the chaos of a sandstorm that the survivors hadn't yet registered them as casualties. They were still at their positions, still focused on the canyon below, still waiting for the signal to begin the ambush. That gave Claire time. Not much time, but enough. She found the 5th target, the man holding the radio handset, the one who would give the signal, and she took him first. He crumpled without a sound. The handset fell into the sand beside him and stayed there. Then something shifted. One of the remaining fighters, a man positioned at the far left of the enemy line, looked over at the radio operator. He looked for 2 seconds, then 3. Then his head came up and he looked around and his posture changed from the loose readiness of a man waiting to the tight alertness of a man who suddenly doesn't understand his environment. He was going to figure it out. Claire fired. 6. The man on the left dropped. She moved to the next target without a breath of hesitation. Her scope tracking right, finding the next heat signature through the thermal attachment. The calculus of windage and distance and drop already complete in her mind before she even settled on the position. She fired 7. At the far end of the enemy line, 2 remaining fighters were now crouching, looking around, talking to each other. Their body language was wrong, not combat ready, but confused, which was almost as dangerous because confused men sometimes do unpredictable things. One of them was pointing toward the canyon. The other was pointing toward the radio operator who was no longer moving. Claire watched them through the scope. She needed them both, and she needed them before either of them transmitted on a secondary radio or fired a flare, or did anything that would alert additional fighters she hadn't located yet. She adjusted her elevation for the wind gust that had just passed across her left shoulder. She could feel the change in pressure, a skill that took years to develop and couldn't be taught from a book. She found the fighter on the right. Fired. 8. The last fighter was moving, not retreating. He was moving toward the crew-served weapon, the heavy machine gun that would have torn the canyon apart if the ambush had gone as planned. He was going to use it, not for the ambush now. He was going to use it because he was alone and something was killing his team, and he couldn't see it, and the machine gun was the only answer he could think of. Claire tracked him. I was moving faster than the previous targets, running, crouching, using the terrain. He was good. He understood fieldcraft. He made himself difficult to follow through a scope in a sandstorm from 3,000 meters. He almost made it to the weapon. Claire fired. 9. The silence that followed wasn't real silence. The storm was still howling. The wind was still driving sand horizontally across the summit. The desert was still the desert. But in the space between what had just happened and what came next, there was something that felt like silence. 9 enemy fighters. 9 shots. One position that nobody in this desert, nobody on that team, nobody in that operations tent had believed she could reach. Claire held still for 3 seconds. She scanned the enemy position through the thermal scope, checking for additional heat signatures, looking for movement she hadn't accounted for. She found none. She scanned the canyon. The SEAL team was still moving, still unaware, still alive, still confused about why the ambush that should have already started hadn't started. Then she heard it. It started as a static pop in her earpiece, the communication system trying to reestablish through the storm, and then Carter's voice came through, broken and rough, but unmistakably him. Say again, anyone on frequency, say again. Claire pressed her transmit button. Overwatch to actual, overwatch to actual. Canyon is clear. Repeat, canyon is clear. Ambush on your north ridge has been neutralized. Continue movement. Static. Then, who is this? Identify yourself. Specialist Bennett, sir. A pause so long she thought the communication had dropped again. Bennett, not a question, not a greeting, something else, something that didn't have a name yet. What's your position? Summit, North Ridge, approximately 3,100 meters from your current position. Another pause. You're on the summit. Yes, sir. You climbed the North Ridge. Yes, sir. She could hear the wind in his transmission. She could hear him breathing. She could hear in the 3 seconds of silence that followed a man who was used to knowing everything about his battlefield, suddenly confronting the fact that he hadn't known something important, that he had missed something, that someone else had seen it and acted on it, and the reason his team was still alive right now was because of the person he had told to stay at the back and not become a problem. Bennett. His voice had changed. She couldn't have described exactly how, but it had changed. How many? 9, sir. The transmission cut for a moment. When it came back, it wasn't Carter. It was Rodriguez, who apparently had gotten onto the frequency, and his voice had a quality in it that she had never heard from him before. 9, Rodriguez said. 9 confirmed from the summit. 9 confirmed, Claire said. Clear your current position and continue the route. I'll maintain overwatch until you're through the canyon. She heard Rodriguez say something away from the radio, not to her, to someone beside him. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard Carter's voice cut back in a moment later. Copy overwatch. Maintain your position. We're moving. Claire lowered herself back into her firing position and kept her scope on the canyon. She wasn't done. She didn't know yet that she was very far from done. Down in the canyon, Carter's mind was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. It was revising. He was a man who built frameworks for understanding situations and then operated within those frameworks with efficiency and confidence. The framework he had built for this mission included Specialist Claire Bennett as a liability, a qualification on paper, a body to manage, a problem to minimize. That framework was gone. He kept moving his team through the canyon, but part of his mind was on the North Ridge. 3,000 meters, summit, alone in a sandstorm. He had physically looked at that ridge during the mission planning phase and categorized it as inaccessible without dedicated climbing support. She had climbed it alone, carrying a 31-pound rifle. And then she had done something that he genuinely did not know was possible. Rodriguez moved up beside him. Carter glanced at him. Rodriguez's expression was the one that appeared on the face of a man who had just been made to feel small, not by something someone did to him, but by something someone did that he realized he could not have done himself. 9 shots, Rodriguez said quietly. Sir, 9 shots in a sandstorm at 3,000 meters. Keep moving, Carter said. That's not, sir. That's not something that... I know what it is, Rodriguez. Carter's voice was sharp, but not at Rodriguez. Not really. Keep moving. Rodriguez fell back. They emerged from the canyon 9 minutes later. The enemy position on the lower ridge was visible now from the canyon exit, and the team slowed involuntarily as they saw it. The vehicles under their camouflage netting the crew-served weapon still on its mount, the bodies in the sand around it. The evidence of an ambush that had been set with care and precision, and that should have worked. Would have worked, except for one person on a summit nobody thought she could reach. Move through, Carter said. We have an objective. Stay focused. They moved. Over the next 3 hours, the mission continued. The SEAL team advanced toward the high-value target compound using the modified route that Claire was coordinating from the summit. She had eyes on everything from her position, not perfect eyes, not the full clarity she would have had on a clear day, but enough. Enough to see movement, enough to see preparation, enough to warn the team 3 separate times about defensive positions that weren't on the original intelligence map. Each time she transmitted, Carter listened. Not because he had decided to trust her completely. Not yet. Trust wasn't a switch that flipped all at once. But because she had been right about the canyon, and a person who has been seriously wrong about something important has a choice. They can defend the wrong position, or they can update. Carter, for all his stubbornness, was a man who updated. At the 0732 mark, 41 minutes into the approach on the compound, Claire's thermal scope picked up something that stopped her cold. A vehicle she hadn't seen in any of the pre-mission intelligence. A heavy truck positioned 600 meters east of the compound's main entrance. Its engine running, she could see the heat signature of the engine block clearly even through the storm. It wasn't moving, it was waiting. And in the bed of the truck, there were 3 shapes that her scope resolved as human beings in prone firing positions. An additional ambush element, not at the canyon, at the objective itself. Overwatch to actual, she transmitted immediately. You have a secondary ambush element. East side of objective 600 meters from the main entrance. Heavy vehicle 3 personnel prone positions. They're waiting for you to commit on the main approach. Carter's response was immediate. Copy. Braking for secondary approach. All elements secondary approach on my command. The team shifted. It happened quickly and quietly, and with the practiced efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this kind of contingency. A secondary approach meant a longer route, additional exposure, more time. But it meant not walking into a second prepared position. Whitman's a big man from the flight line. The one who had made the mascot comment was at the second position in the formation. He heard the transmission. He felt the formation change direction. And in his mind, he did the math that every soldier does when they realize they almost walked into something they didn't see. He thought about what he had said on the flight line. He thought about it for approximately 1 second, which was all the time the mission allowed. Then he kept moving. The compound was reached at 0849 hours. The secondary approach put them at a defensive angle that allowed the team to address the compound's eastern perimeter without exposing themselves to the additional ambush vehicle. Claire maintained position on the summit, watching the vehicle to the east, watching the team, watching the environment. Her hands were steady, but she was cold now. Not from the temperature, which had actually risen significantly as the morning advanced. Cold from something else. From the accumulation of hours of sustained concentration and physical effort, and the quiet knowledge that she was completely alone on a mountain summit with a storm that was not finished with her yet. She didn't show it. She had learned very early that showing a thing gives other people the option of responding to it, and she preferred not to give people that option. The compound breach happened at 0917 hours. It was fast and professional, and Carter ran it the way he ran everything, with precision and aggression, and a refusal to leave anything to chance. Claire heard the transmission traffic from the breach team and tracked the timeline. The compound was cleared in 11 minutes. The high-value target was located and secured. The mission was accomplished, but Claire was not celebrating. Because while the team had been focused on the compound, while she had been watching the secondary ambush vehicle, she had not been watching her own position carefully enough. She realized her mistake when she heard the sound, not above the wind, under it. The particular scrape of boot on rock that she had heard approximately 40 times in the last 3 hours, and learned to automatically categorize as her own movement. This was not her own movement. Someone was climbing toward her. She pulled her eye from the scope and looked back along the ridge. 3 figures, moving upward from the eastern face of the mountain, a face she hadn't been watching because she had been pointed west toward the canyon and then south towards the compound. They were moving efficiently using the terrain, the way people move when they know mountains and know how to use them. Her radio crackled. Actual to Overwatch. Compound is secure. What's your status? Claire looked at the 3 figures. They were approximately 400 meters below her, moving fast. She pressed transmit. Overwatch is fine, sir. Target secured. Confirmed. We're prepping for extraction. Need your position for pickup. 400 meters below her on the eastern face, one of the figures stopped and raised something to his face. She thought for a moment it was a radio. Then she realized it was optics. He was looking directly at her. He had found her. Overwatch. Carter's voice was more direct now. I need your extraction coordinates. Claire watched the 3 figures begin moving again. Faster now. She had a 31-pound rifle. She had a sidearm that was useful at approximately 50 meters. She had the terrain, and she had the simple, clarifying reality that the mission was complete. The team was safe, and the only problem remaining was a problem that was 400 meters away and closing. She pressed transmit. Sir, she said, I have a small situation up here. Carter's response was immediate. Define small. 3 additional fighters. They found my position. They're climbing. The silence on the other end of the radio lasted exactly 2 seconds. How far out? 400 meters, moving fast. Can you relocate? Claire looked at the ridgeline. The summit she was on was the highest point for several hundred meters in any direction. Moving off the summit meant losing her visibility advantage. It also meant moving toward the fighters rather than away from them. No, sir. Can you hold? She thought about the 31-pound rifle that was accurate to 3,000 meters and nearly useless at 50. She thought about the sidearm. She thought about the terrain around her and what it offered. Yes, sir, she said. And then because she was who she was, she said, go complete your extraction. I'll handle this. Another pause. Longer this time. Bennett. Carter's voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not from him, not directed at her. Don't make me explain to command why I left you on a mountain. Then don't leave me on a mountain, sir, she said. Come get me. I just need about 15 minutes. She released the transmit button and turned back to the eastern face. 350 meters, moving fast. She looked at the terrain between her position and theirs. She had been a sniper for long enough to understand that the distance between 2 people on a mountain is not a fixed measurement. It is a dynamic that changes based on who controls what ground. The fighter who controls the high ground controls the engagement. That was true whether you had a long-range rifle or a rock. She had a long-range rifle, a sidearm, and an education. She began to work. She moved 20 meters to her left along the ridge using a natural fold in the terrain to create a low wall of rock that would require the climbing fighters to expose themselves above it before they could see her position. She identified 3 specific choke points in the approach places where the terrain forced a narrow passage and a person climbing would have no lateral cover. She set herself up for the first choke point, 300 meters. She could use the Che-Tech at 300 meters. It was significantly overpowered for that range, but it was what she had, and a round was a round. She waited. The first fighter appeared at the choke point. He was moving carefully, crouched low, using the rock to either side. He was good. He had clearly done this before. He paused at the narrowest point, reading the terrain above him, trying to locate her position. He was looking in the wrong direction. She had moved. Claire fired. The concussion of the Che-Tech at close range was a different animal than it was at distance. At distance, it was a contained mechanical event. Pull the trigger, absorb the recoil, maintain the scope picture. At close range, it was thunder. The sound bounced off the rock walls and came back from 3 directions at once. The first fighter went down. The second fighter dove for cover behind a rock formation to the left. The third fighter reversed a direction and moved back down the slope, not retreating completely, but seeking better cover and a wider approach angle. Claire worked the bolt. She moved again. 20 meters right, new position, find the rock she had identified as cover for the second fighter. There. She could see his silhouette against the lighter rock behind him. He was pressed flat, rifle up, scanning for her. I was looking at where she had been. She fired. 2. The third fighter was somewhere below her on the eastern face out of her sight line, possibly calling for additional support. That was the problem she couldn't solve from her current position. She didn't know what he was doing, which meant she didn't know what was coming. She moved back to her original position and pressed transmit. 2 down, she said. Third fighter is somewhere on the eastern face, lost visual. Could be calling for support. Carter's voice came back immediately. Copy. We're moving. ETA to your position 14 minutes. 14 minutes. She could hold for 14 minutes. What she couldn't hold was the feeling in her left shoulder, the hand she had cut on the way up the arm that had been absorbing the Chaytak's recoil for the last 3+ hours in a position that was not ergonomically designed for someone her size. The shoulder was telling her things she didn't want to hear. Not catastrophic things, but significant things. The kind of things that meant time was a resource she was spending faster than she realized. She found the third fighter. He hadn't called for support. Or if he hadn't waited for it. He had found a different route up the eastern face, a longer route, a wider angle, and he was now coming over a section of the ridge, approximately 60 meters to her right, a section she hadn't fully covered in her initial position analysis. He came over the ridge at speed. She pivoted right and brought the Chaytak around, and the distance was 40 meters, and the angle was wrong. And he was already raising his weapon. And for one fraction of 1 second, everything was very simple and very clear. She drew her sidearm. She fired twice. The third fighter went down at 38 meters. Claire stood still for a moment, breathing. Then she lowered the sidearm and checked it and holstered it and sat down on the rock because her legs had decided without consulting her that sitting was a reasonable choice right now. Her left shoulder was genuinely angry at her. Her hands were steady. She pressed transmit. Overwatch to actual. 3 down. Position is clear. Carter's voice. Copy. We're on the north approach. Keep your head down. She almost smiled at that. Keep your head down. As if she hadn't been keeping her head exactly where it needed to be for the last 4.5 hours. She looked out at the desert from the summit. The storm was beginning to thin at the edges, the way storms do when they've spent themselves, when the violence has moved on and left behind only the evidence of what it was. The canyon below was still partially obscured. The compound to the south was invisible. She could see the sky brightening in the east, the sun pushing through the thinning dust. She thought about Carter's face in the operations tent. She thought about him saying, "You are not built for this mission." She thought about Rodriguez and his offer to carry the rifle and the look on his face when she had said it was her responsibility. She thought about the tire tracks on the ridge in the aerial photograph. 14 hours old, sitting in a mission folder that nobody had looked at as carefully as she had. She thought about her instructor, Corporal Reeves, and what he had said. The rifle doesn't care how big you are. The rifle only cares if you're right. She had been right. 9 shots at 3,050 meters. 3 more at close range. A team that was alive because she had broken formation and climbed a mountain and refused to accept that what she saw in a 14-hour-old photograph was something she could hand off to someone else's judgment. She heard the sound of the team before she saw them. Boots on rock, the clink of equipment, the specific controlled noise of a group of people moving fast with purpose. Then they appeared below her on the northern face, 12 figures climbing toward her position, moving with the kind of urgency that meant they had heard the transmission about the third fighter and drawn their own conclusions. Carter was at the front. He saw her before he reached her. She was sitting on the rock left shoulder, lower than the right sidearm, holstered Chaytak beside her. She looked exactly the way a person looks after 4.5 hours of sustained extreme effort, not broken but spent. Honestly, completely spent. He climbed the last 20 meters and stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a moment. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for 3 full seconds, which was a long time given everything that had just happened. Then Carter said, 3 additional fighters. Yes, sir. At close range. Yes, sir. With a sidearm. The Chaytak was a bit much for 38 meters, she said. Something moved across Carter's face. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was something that happened to his expression in spite of himself. Something he wasn't trying to show, but couldn't quite stop. He looked at the eastern face of the ridge. He looked at the 3 figures down there in the rock. He looked back at her. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Your shoulder." She glanced at her left shoulder. "It's been better." "Rodriguez," Carter said without looking back. Rodriguez was already there. He didn't say anything. He simply picked up the Chaytak, all 31 pounds of it, and held it in a way that said he understood that what he was holding was not just a rifle, but something she had carried up a mountain alone and used to save 12 lives. He held it carefully. "Let's go," Carter said. Claire stood. Her legs cooperated. The team moved around her, not ahead of her, not behind her. Around her, the way a formation shifts when the center of gravity has moved. The way people move when they understand, without anyone having to say it, that the geometry of a situation has changed. Whitman fell in on her left, the big man who had said what he had said on the flight line. I didn't say anything now. He just walked beside her with the quiet, steady presence of someone who had processed something significant and was still working through what it meant. The extraction helicopter was inbound. The storm was thinning. The desert was getting lighter. And 12 men who had walked into that canyon thinking one thing were walking out, knowing something different, something about swiss and capability, and the particular courage it takes to be right when everyone around you is convinced you're wrong. Claire walked with them. Her shoulder hurt. Her hands were steady. She had left the summit, but the summit was still with her. The extraction helicopter touched down at 1124 hours. Not at the base, not at the compound. At a flat stretch of desert floor 3 kilometers north of the canyon, a secondary pickup zone that Carter had called in when it became clear that the primary zone, which sat within sight of the ambush ridge, was no longer a clean option. The team that had moved fast and quiet across those 3 kilometers, Claire in the middle of the formation, now instead of at the rear. Whitman on her left, Rodriguez carrying her rifle on her right, and Carter 2 positions ahead, where she could see the set of his shoulders and the way he moved in the specific quality of his silence. Carter's silence was different now. It wasn't the dismissive silence from the operations tent. It wasn't the silence of a man who had already decided what he thought. It was the silence of a man who was actively thinking, which was a more demanding kind of quiet. The helicopter was a modified Black Hawk crew of 4, and it came in low and fast through the thinning edge of the Sandstorm, with the specific controlled aggression of a pilot who had done this enough times that the storm was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. It touched down for 11 seconds. The team loaded with the efficiency of people who understood that 11 seconds on the ground in hostile terrain was 11 seconds too many. Claire climbed aboard third from last. Her left shoulder had stiffened during the walk from the mountain, the way injuries do when the adrenaline that has been managing them steps back and lets the actual damage introduce itself. She didn't ask for help getting in. Rodriguez was right behind her, and she could feel him hovering in the particular way of someone who wants to offer assistance, but has learned in the last 4 hours that offering assistance to this specific person requires careful judgment. She got in without help. Rodriguez handed her the Chaytak as he boarded. She took it with her right hand and held it across her lap and said nothing. The helicopter lifted. For approximately 2 minutes, nobody spoke. The rotors were loud enough to make conversation difficult, and the team used that as permission to not begin one. 12 operators and 1 specialist in a Black Hawk, rising above the thinning storm, the desert falling away beneath them. The canyon visible now from above, a long dark scar in the landscape that they had walked through alive because of decisions made and shots taken from a summit 3,000 meters away. Then Rodriguez said it. I didn't plan to say it. Claire could tell from the way it came out, not carefully considered, just honest, the kind of thing that falls out of a person's mouth when their internal filter is exhausted. He looked at the rifle in her lap, and then he looked at her face and he said, I'm sorry about what I said on the flight line. The helicopter banked slightly. Nobody in the team reacted to the movement. Claire looked at him. Which part? Rodriguez had the grace to look uncomfortable. All of it. The thing about the rifle weighing more than you. He stopped. Started again. I was a jerk. You were, Claire agreed. I'm sorry. I know, she said. She turned and looked out the helicopter's window at the desert below. Rodriguez stared at the side of her face for a moment, apparently trying to determine if that was the end of the conversation or the beginning of something else. Then he turned and looked at his own hands and stayed quiet. Whitman across from her was watching the exchange. He hadn't said anything during the walk from the mountain. He hadn't said anything on the helicopter yet. He was the kind of man who processed things at his own pace and resisted being rushed. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when a person is chewing on something that isn't food. He finally said the mascot comment. That was me. Claire turned from the window. I know, she said again. He paused. That wasn't right. She looked at him for a long moment. Whitman was 6'2", 230 pounds, 11 years in special operations, a man who had never once in his career been doubted based on how he looked when he stepped off an aircraft. He was sitting in a helicopter right now, with his life intact because of the woman he had compared to a mascot 4 hours ago. She could see him understanding that. She could see the weight of it on his face. No, she said, it wasn't. Then she added quietly, but you came back for me. Whitman blinked. She turned back to the window. The helicopter reached FOB Sandridge at 12:09 hours. The landing was routine. The debrief was not. Carter went directly to the communications room and began transmitting the mission report before the rotor blades had stopped turning. This was normal standard operating procedure, required an initial mission report within 30 minutes of extraction. What was not standard was what Carter chose to include in it. The initial field report went to Squadron Command. It noted mission success objective secured HVT in custody, 0 friendly casualties. It noted the engagement at the canyon. It noted the engagement at the compound approach. It noted the additional engagement at the extraction point. And then in the section titled Contributing Factors Mission Success, Carter wrote one sentence. He wrote, mission success is attributed primarily to the independent tactical decision and precision engagement of Specialist Claire Bennett, whose unauthorized departure from assigned formation and subsequent overwatch from the North Summit Ridge neutralized a prepared ambush that would have resulted in catastrophic friendly casualties. He looked at that sentence for approximately 30 seconds. Then he sent the report without changing a word. Claire didn't know about the report yet. She was in the medical bay, which was a generous term for a tent with 2 cots and a medic named Corporal Diaz, who had the calm, unimpressed manner of someone who had been stitching up special operations personnel long enough that nothing surprised him anymore. Diaz examined her left shoulder and then examined the cut on her left hand and then looked at her with the expression of a man who is calculating how to say something a person might not want to hear. The shoulder is a grade 2 strain, he said. Probably happened on the climb. The CHATAC didn't help. The recoil on that weapon in a compromised position is significant. I'm aware, Claire said. You need rest ice, anti-inflammatories, and no lifting for how long until I can operate? Diaz looked at her. I just said no lifting for, I heard you, Claire said. How long until I can operate? Diaz made a sound that conveyed professional resignation. 3 weeks if you follow the protocol, 2 if you're stubborn. 1, Claire said. That's not medically. 1, she said again. Not aggressively, just matter-of-factly, the way you state something that has already been decided. Diaz wrapped her shoulder in silence. Outside the medical tent, the base was doing what bases do after a successful operation debriefing, resupplying, processing, and in the particular way of military units talking. The SEAL team had been standing down for less than an hour, but the story of what had happened on the North Summit was already moving through the base, the way significant things move through enclosed spaces fast, and with details that were accurate in their essence, even when they were inexact in their particulars. 9 shots, 3,000 meters, Sandstorm alone. People who hadn't been on the mission were hearing it from people who had. People who had been on the mission were processing it in the way individuals process things that exceed their expectations, not all at once, but in waves, with each wave arriving with a little more clarity than the one before. In the operations tent, 3 of the SEAL operators were sitting around the mission planning table. Not planning, just sitting the way men sit when they're working through something together without quite saying that's what they're doing. There was a coffee thermos in the middle of the table that nobody was refilling. There were some maps. There was the specific quality of quiet that follows an operation where the math of what could have happened is still being calculated. Sergeant Marsh, who had been at the rear of the formation during the canyon passage and had therefore been the closest to the ambush. Killzone was the one who finally said what all 3 of them were thinking. I was right into the center of it, he said. When she called clear on the frequency, I had no idea, none. I thought we were just walking through a canyon. The man beside him, an operator named Torres, turned his coffee cup in his hands. She called it before we even left the base. I know. Carter didn't listen. I know, Marsh said again. I didn't listen either. He looked at the table. I was standing right there when she was talking to him. I heard every word she said about the canyon, about the 14-hour window. He paused. I thought she was being cautious, like overcautious, like someone trying to prove something. She was proving something, Torres said. No, she was doing her job. Marsh picked up his coffee. There's a difference. Torres nodded slowly. The third operator, a quiet man named Park, who rarely contributed to group conversations, looked up from the table and said, "Where is she now, Medical?" Torres said. Park nodded, said nothing else. But something about the question felt like the beginning of a decision. Claire came out of the medical tent at 13:47 hours. Her left arm was in a sling. Diaz had been insistent about that much. She had the sling on, but her posture suggested that she considered it a suggestion rather than a requirement. She was moving toward the dining facility, which was the next logical step after 4.5 hours of sustained physical effort and nothing to eat since over 300 hours when she heard her name. Specialist Bennett, she turned. Carter was standing outside the communications room. He had changed out of his mission gear and was in standard duty uniform, but he looked like a man who hadn't yet fully transitioned from one state to another, like the mission was still finishing in his mind even as his body had moved on. She stopped. "Sir." He walked toward her. When he reached her, he stopped at a conversational distance, not the commanding distance he had used in the operations tent, but something more personal. "How's the shoulder?" he asked. "Fine, sir." He looked at the sling. "Diaz says grade 2 strain. He mentioned that. He also says you negotiated him down to 1 week recovery." "I suggested 1 week," Claire said. "He may have a different recollection." Something happened to Carter's expression, the same thing that had happened on the summit, the involuntary thing that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same space. "I sent the mission report," he said. "Yes, sir." "I attributed mission success to your engagement." Claire looked at him for a moment. "Sir, the mission was a team effort. The mission was alive because of one person," Carter said. "That's not a team attribution. That's the accurate assessment." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about the canyon. I was wrong about your assessment when we were planning. I was wrong about your capability." He said each sentence the way a man says something he has decided to say fully, not partially. "I'm telling you that directly because I believe people deserve to hear corrections the same way they hear criticisms." Claire said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You waited for me." Carter frowned slightly. "What at extraction? You waited." She met his eyes. "The regulation is—" "I know what the regulation is," Carter said. "You didn't follow it." "No," he said, "I didn't." A pause. "Thank you," Claire said. "Mom." He nodded once. Short, direct. The way acknowledgement moves between people who communicate in the same language. Then he said, "Get some food. Debrief is at 1600. "Yes, sir." He turned and walked back toward the communications room. Claire watched him for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the dining facility. She was 20 feet from the entrance when the radio on her belt, the team frequency, which she was still technically assigned to, came alive with a sound that stopped everything. Not a voice, an alert tone, a specific sequence of tones that the military used for one specific category of communication. "Emergency." She stopped. The frequency crackled. A voice she didn't recognize, communications officer from squadron, came through fast and direct. "All elements, FOB Sandridge, be advised. Intelligence indicates a secondary hostile element aware of your current location. Estimated size 12 to 18 personnel. Estimated time to arrival at FOB Sandridge, 40 to 60 minutes. This is not a drill. Commanding officer to communications room immediately. All personnel to defensive positions." The desert had just changed again. Claire stood outside the dining facility for exactly 3 seconds. She turned around. She walked back toward the medical tent. Diaz looked up when she came in. He saw her face. He didn't ask questions. "I need the shoulder workable for the next several hours," she said. "Specialist. What do you have that will hold it together without making me useless?" Diaz stared at her. Then he stood up and went to his medical kit. He worked for 4 minutes, a corticosteroid injection directly into the joint, a compression wrap tighter than the sling, KT tape applied in a pattern that would give her range of motion while providing support. He said nothing while he worked. When he finished, he looked at her. "This is going to hurt," he said. "I know," she said. "Not during, after. When this wears off tonight, it is going to significantly hurt." "I understand." He looked at her for another moment. "Try not to fire the Che-tac with that arm." "I'll use my right," she said. She walked out. In the communications room, Carter was already on the radio with Squadron. The alert had been based on intercepted communication. One of the surviving enemy elements from the operation had reported the FOB's location to a larger force that had been operating in the area as a rapid response unit. The force was estimated at 14 personnel mobile, and based on the last known position, they were between 42 and 58 minutes out. Phoebe Sandridge was not a fortified position. It was a forward-based temporary structures, essential equipment, and a skeleton crew of support personnel who were not special operations trained. The SEAL team was the defensive capability, and the SEAL team had just come off a 4-hour operation in extreme conditions. Carter pulled his team together in 5 minutes flat. The briefing was short. Carter wasn't one for long briefings when time was the critical resource. 14 plus personnel inbound, 40 to 50 minutes. We're the only defensive element. Support staff to harden positions in the equipment storage area. Team were going to set the perimeter. He moved quickly through the assignments: who covered north, southeast, west, who handled the vehicle, who maintained communication. Fast, direct, no wasted words. Then he stopped. He looked at Claire, who was standing at the back of the group. The team had noticed she was there. Most of them had glanced at her when she walked in. Nobody had said anything about the sling, or the fact that she had just come from the medical tent, or the fact that she had been in sustained combat for 4.5 hours and had then negotiated a corticosteroid injection from a medic who clearly hadn't wanted to give it to her. Carter looked at her for 2 seconds. "Bennett," he said, "can you shoot?" "Yes, sir." "Right-handed?" "Effectively." He looked at the Che-tac she was carrying back in her possession, taken from Rodriguez, as soon as she'd come out of the communications room after the alert. He thought about what he knew about that weapon and what he knew about the woman holding it. "Northridge has the best elevation line on the approach route," he said. 500 meters, not your range." "No," she agreed, "but it'll work." Carter made a decision. "You have the North Ridge," he said. "Torres is your spotter. Move now." "Yes, sir," she moved. Torres was already beside her, having apparently decided during the briefing that he was going with her regardless of the assignment. He was carrying his own rifle and a spotting scope, and the expression of a man who had made peace with the situation. As they moved toward the North Ridge at a fast walk, Torres said, "You should be in the medical tent." "Diaz said I could have 2 weeks off," Claire said. "I took one." Torres looked at her. "That's not what—" He stopped, shook his head. "You know what, never mind." They reached the North Ridge in 6 minutes. It wasn't the same mountain she had climbed during the mission. It was a natural elevation on the north perimeter of the Phoebe Lower, but with a clear sight line across the desert to the north and northwest. Claire set up her position in 3 minutes. Torres was beside her, spotting scope up, already reading the terrain. "Wind is down," he said. 8 knots northwest. Temperature climbing. "I see it," Claire said. "Range to the approach road." 480, she said. 490 at the bend. Torres adjusted his scope. "Agreed." He paused. "Range to that dried riverbed to the left." 610. Torres lowered the spotting scope slightly and looked at her. "You range everything automatically, don't you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said, "all the time, all the time." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I've been doing this for 8 years. I don't do that." "You probably could," she said, "if you'd been doing it for 10. Torres was quiet again. He put the spotting scope back up. At 5:02 hours, with approximately 22 minutes remaining in the window, Torres picked up movement on the approach road. "Contact north," he said. 4 vehicles, approach road 1,200 meters, moving fast. Claire found them in her scope. 4 vehicles, 2 pickup trucks with covered beds, 2 lighter vehicles that moved with the erratic urgency of people who knew they had a time window and were using it. 14 personnel estimated. They were spread across the vehicles in a way that suggested coordination, not a convoy exactly, but elements that had talked to each other about what they were approaching. Charlie transmitted. "Overwatch north to actual. 4 vehicles, 1,200 meters approach road. Alluvi toward Phobe at speed." Carter's voice. "Copy. Let them close to 800. We want them fully committed." "Understood." She waited. Torres watched the vehicles through his scope. He was counting, estimating, doing the same math she was doing. If they split at the fork, he said, some of them might go around. If they split at the fork, Claire said, we're going to have a busier afternoon than planned. The vehicles closed. 1,100 meters, 1,900. Still on the road, Torres said. No split yet. 850 meters. Then the lead vehicle slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The kind of slowing that happens when a driver sees something and is deciding what it means. Claire tracked it through her scope, watching the vehicle, watching the road ahead of it, trying to understand what the driver was seeing. The lead vehicle stopped completely. They stopped, Torres said. I see it. What did they? Torres adjusted his scope. There's something on the road. 12 o'clock, 880 meters. Claire found it. One of the Phobe's support vehicles, an LMTV truck, had been moved to block the road as part of the defensive preparation. It sat broadside across the approach road like a blunt declaration. The lead vehicle had stopped because the road was blocked. For 30 seconds, nothing moved. Then the lead vehicle reversed, and the driver turned north, off-road. They're flanking, Claire said into the radio. Lead vehicle is going north off-road. I'm estimating the remaining vehicles will follow. Carter's voice was controlled. How long to reposition? If they go north and circle 8 minutes. If they push through the terrain directly 4. Copy. North element, shift your coverage right. Already moving, Claire said. She repositioned 12 meters right along the ridge, Torres beside her, finding the new angle that covered the off-road approach. The 4 vehicles had all turned north now, spread out slightly, moving across the desert floor with the rattling urgency of vehicles pushed beyond their comfortable speed. Claire found the lead truck in her scope again, 800 meters. The Chaytak at 800 meters was not a difficult shot in good conditions. These were not perfect conditions, but they were better than the summit, better than the Sandstorm, better than 38 meters with a sidearm while 3 people were climbing toward her. She waited for Carter's order. The vehicles were 700 meters out. 650. Carter's voice, engage at your discretion, overwatch. Don't let them close to 400. Copy, Claire said. She found the engine block of the lead vehicle. She fired. The truck stopped. Not dramatically. It just stopped the way a vehicle stops when its engine has been removed from the equation, and the 3 vehicles behind it had to brake hard and split to avoid hitting it. The formation that had been relatively cohesive 30 seconds ago suddenly wasn't. Personnel began dismounting. They're out of the vehicles, Torres said, spreading left and right. Count 9, 10, 11 visible. 3 more probably behind the lead truck. I see them, Claire said. She was already finding the next target. The engagement that followed was not clean the way the summit had been clean. It was not one unhurried shot at a time from a position of calm authority. It was fast, continuous, the kind of work that asks everything of a person's training because the situation is moving and the targets are moving and the decisions don't wait for certainty. She fired 7 times in 4 minutes. Her shoulder screamed at her on the 4th shot. She absorbed it and fired the 5th. Torres was calling corrections beside her. Left, adjust, left 50 meters there. And she was processing each one and moving between shots with a speed that she knew she could maintain, but that she also knew was costing her. By the time the SEAL team's ground elements engaged the remaining hostile personnel from their defensive positions, the north approach had been degraded significantly. The coordination that the hostile force had arrived with was gone. Their vehicles were disabled or abandoned. Their personnel were dispersed across open ground with no cover and no functional plan. The engagement lasted 11 minutes from first shot to last. When it ended, the desert was quiet again. Torres lowered his spotting scope and looked at Claire. She was holding herself very still in a way that had nothing to do with tactical discipline. Bennett, he said. I'm fine, she said. You're not fine. I'm functional, she said. That's different. He looked at her left arm in its compression wrap. He looked at the way she was holding her upper body slightly rotated, the way a person holds themselves when one side is significantly worse than the other side. When Diaz said it would hurt, Torres said carefully. He was right, Claire said. She lowered the Chaytak very slowly, using her right arm to do most of the work. Her radio crackled. Carter. North Ridge report. Torres reached over and took the radio from her belt. He pressed transmit. North Ridge is clear. Overwatch is... He looked at Claire. She looked back at him with an expression that was not a request for mercy. Overwatch is effective, Torres said. Somewhere on personnel, we're coming down. Copy, all clear called at perimeter, come in. Torres clipped the radio back to her belt. He picked up the Chaytak. She didn't argue this time. They came down from the ridge in silence. The late afternoon desert had cooled slightly from the peak and the storm was gone entirely. The sky back to its sharp desert blue. The FOB was reassembling itself after the defensive engagement support personnel emerging from hardened positions, team members checking in the particular controlled energy of a place that had just been tested and had held. When Claire and Torres came through the perimeter, the team was assembled near the operations tent. They saw her. They saw the compression wrap. They saw the way she was moving. They saw Torres carrying her rifle for the second time in one day. Nobody said the wrong thing. Whitman walked toward her and stopped at a respectful distance, not too close, not the dismissive distance from the flight line. How bad, he asked. Manageable, she said, and held her gaze. You didn't have to take the ridge, with the shoulder. No, she agreed. Why did you? She thought about the question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the right answer. Not the tactical answer, not the professional answer, but the true one. Because it was the right position, she said, and I was the right person for it. Whitman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yeah. He said it the way you say a thing when you've stopped arguing with it. Yeah, you were. He stepped aside as Carter approached. Carter looked at her. She looked back. Around them, the team was doing the quiet work of the aftermath equipment, checks, communication reports, the documentation that followed every engagement. But there was a stillness in the way they were arranged, the way they had unconsciously formed up with Claire, roughly at the center that had not been present 8 hours ago on the flight line. Something had shifted, not officially, not on paper, not yet. But the kind of shift that happens in people, before it happens in documents, the kind that is harder to undo and more permanent than anything written in a report. Carter said, debrief, 10 minutes. He looked at her shoulder, he looked at her face. He said, quieter. After that, Diaz. Yes, sir, Claire said. He nodded, he turned back to the tent. Torres set the Chaytak down beside her carefully. She put her right hand on it, not picking it up, just touching it. The habit of a person who checks on something the way others check on a friend. The rifle was fine, she was fine. Different kinds of fine, the kind that required certain maintenance. The kind that had been built through years of proving in empty rooms and empty fields, and now in a desert that hadn't cared who she was. That capability didn't come from chasing certainty, didn't come from comfort. And the hardest shots were never the ones measured in meters. The sun was dropping toward the western horizon. The desert was quiet. The debrief was in 10 minutes. And somewhere in an operations tent, Carter was writing a correction to the understanding that everyone at FOB Sandridge had arrived with this morning. The understanding that would need to be rewritten again and again in every unit and every room where someone small walked in carrying something heavy until the day it finally didn't need rewriting anymore. Claire picked up her rifle. She walked toward the tent. The debrief started at 1600 hours and ran for 91 minutes. Carter ran it the same way he ran everything methodically without sentiment, moving through each phase of the operation from insertion to extraction with the specific discipline of a man who believed that the most important thing you could do after a mission was understand it completely. What worked, what didn't, what decisions had been made and why, what decisions should have been made differently. That last category was where the room got quiet. There were 11 people in the tent, the full SEAL team minus 2 who were handling equipment maintenance and communication duties outside. Claire was at the far end of the table, not because she had chosen that position, but because she had arrived last coming from the medical tent where Diaz had added a second layer of compression wrap and said things about the shoulder that she had processed and set aside. Carter moved through the mission timeline efficiently. Insertion, movement to objective, the canyon. He stopped at the canyon. At the pre-mission briefing, he said, looking at the table rather than at any individual in the room, Specialist Bennett identified the canyon approach as a potential ambush site. She noted the 14-hour window since the last satellite pass. She noted the sightlines. She noted the terrain advantage that the canyon walls would give to a prepared position. He paused. I dismissed her assessment. Another pause. That was wrong. The room was very still. Carter looked up from the table. He didn't look at Claire specifically. He looked at the room as a whole, the way a leader speaks to a team rather than to individuals, when the thing being said belongs to everyone. In 15 years of special operations, I have made decisions in incomplete information environments every single time. That's the nature of this work. Some of those decisions have been right, some have been wrong. The ones that were wrong, I've tried to learn from. He moved a map on the table without looking at it. What I did in the planning phase of this mission was not a decision made in incomplete information. I had the information. Specialist Bennett gave it to me. What I made was an assumption about capability, about experience, about what a person's file means versus what a person actually is. He looked at the table again. Assumptions in this environment cost lives. Today they almost cost 12. Marsh, who had been sitting with his jaw set for the last 10 minutes, looked up. Sir, with respect, we didn't know. Any of us. He glanced around the table. It wasn't just you. No, Carter said, it wasn't. He looked at Marsh, which is why I'm saying it to this room instead of a mirror. Whitman was sitting 2 seats from Claire. He hadn't looked at her since she'd sat down, not avoiding her, but processing. She could tell the difference. She had spent enough time being looked at and looked away from to understand the difference between avoidance and thought. Torres broke in. I want to talk about the Northridge engagement, because I was the spotter and I want this on record. He looked at Carter. Specialist Bennett took that position with a grade 2 shoulder strain, 1 functional arm, and a corticosteroid injection holding her together. In under 4 minutes, she was set up and ranging. She fired 7 effective rounds in a sustained engagement that disabled or neutralized their approach capability before we had a full defensive perimeter. He paused. I've been spotting for different shooters for 6 years. I've never watched anyone do that. Rodriguez, across the table, said, the canyon was 19 shots total, 9 on the summit, 3 on the eastern face during the close-range engagement. He had apparently been doing the math during the debrief. From the summit to the sidearm, 3 different weapons, 3 different ranges over 4 hours. 2 weapons, Claire said. It was the first time she had spoken in the debrief. Everyone looked at her. The Chaytak and the sidearm, she said. The close-range shots on the eastern face were all sidearm. 9 plus 3 is 12. Then 7 on the North Ridge this afternoon. She said it not to impress, but to correct the way she corrected anything inaccurate with the simple compulsion of a person who needed things to be true. Rodriguez stared at her. 19 total engagements, he said slowly. Today. Yes, he looked at Carter. Carter looked at the table. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Park, who had barely spoken in 2 days, said from the far end of the room, she warned us about the canyon. Nobody listened. She saved the mission anyway. He looked around the table. What does that tell us? The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. Nobody answered immediately because the answer was uncomfortable, and they were all adults who understood that the discomfort was the point. It was Whitman who finally said it. It tells us we almost died because of what she looks like, he said. His voice was flat and direct, and he didn't dress it up. And we didn't because of what she is. He looked at Claire. That's what it tells us. Claire held his gaze. She said nothing. The debrief continued. By the time it ended at 17:31 hours, the light outside the tent had gone from afternoon gold to early evening, amber the desert, cooling in the particular fast way it cools once the sun drops below the mountain line. Carter dismissed the team and they filed out, most of them quiet, a few talking in the low voices of people continuing a conversation that had started inside. Claire was moving toward the tent entrance when Carter said her name. She stopped. Shut the door, he said. She pulled the tent flap closed. The 2 of them stood in the tent alone, the mission map still on the table, the coffee that had been brewed for the debrief, cooling in the thermos, the specific intimacy of a private conversation after a public one. Carter sat on the edge of the table. I need to ask you something, he said. Sir, when you broke formation this morning, he looked at her directly. You knew the risk to yourself, the climb alone, the storm, the close-range engagement at the summit. You knew all of that going in. Yes, sir. And you also knew that I had explicitly ordered you to stay with the team. Yes, sir. So I need to understand. He stopped, started again. Help me understand the decision point, not the tactical logic. I understand the tactical logic. I want to understand the personal logic. Claire considered the question. It wasn't a trap. She had been in enough conversations with commanders to know the difference between a question that was looking for a weapon and a question that was genuinely looking for an answer. This was the second kind. I thought about following the order, she said. For approximately 22 minutes sitting by the motor pool, I thought about what it meant to follow the order. She paused. I've been given wrong orders before. Every operator has. The difference is when a wrong order has consequences that you can see clearly and the person giving the order cannot. Carter was listening without moving. You couldn't see the tire tracks, she said. Not because you weren't looking, because you'd made a decision about what you thought the threat level was, and once that decision was made, the photograph was already answered in your mind. She met his eyes. I was looking at the photograph without the answer already in my head. So I saw it. And the order, Carter said, staying with the team. If I stay with the team, Claire said, and the ambush happens the way I predicted the order was followed and 12 people die. If I break the order and I'm wrong, I've climbed a mountain alone for no reason, and the worst consequence is that you're angry with me. She paused. That's not a difficult calculation, sir. Carter was quiet for a long moment. You weren't afraid, he said, not a question exactly. I was afraid the whole time, she said. I was afraid on the climb. I was afraid when I found the fighters on the ridge. I was afraid when communication went down, and I was the only person who could see what was happening. She looked at him steadily. I'm afraid most of the time. I just don't let it make decisions. Something changed in Carter's face. Not the involuntary almost smile from before. Something deeper, something that looked like recognition, the expression of a person who has heard something that was also true of themselves and had not expected to hear it from this particular source. The report I sent to Squadron, he said. Yes, sir. It's going to generate attention. Command is going to want to know specifics. The shot data, the timeline, the position details. He paused. There will likely be a formal review. I understand. You're not concerned about the review. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. No, sir. The facts are the fact. Carter stood from the table. He straightened his uniform in the absent automatic way of someone who has worn a uniform for so long. The gesture happens without thought. He moved toward the tent entrance and then stopped. Bennett, he said, his back to her. What your instructor told you. The rifle doesn't care how big you are. She went still. He turned. I read your training file. Corporal Reeves wrote it in your evaluation. I read it this morning before the mission. He looked at her. I read it and I still sent you to the back of the formation. The quiet in the tent was complete. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I want you to know that what happened today wasn't about me not having information, he said. I had information. I had your file, your evaluation, your qualification scores. I chose not to apply them because he stopped. He had the expression of a man saying something aloud that he had previously only admitted to himself. Because you didn't look like what I expected. Claire didn't say anything. That's on me, Carter said. Not the unit's culture, not the military, not the environment. Me, I made a personal judgment that had no tactical basis and I applied it to a mission decision. He held her gaze. That won't happen again. I know, she said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. You waited on the mountain, she said. You didn't have to. Regulation was clear. You made a different choice. She paused. A person who changes that fast under pressure doesn't repeat the mistake that made the change necessary. Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, get some food, rest that shoulder. He walked out. Claire stood alone in the tent for 30 seconds. Then she walked to the mission map and looked at it one more time, the route, the canyon, the summit, the North Ridge. The geography of a day that had started with laughter on a flight line and ended with something that didn't have a name yet, but was taking up space in the room wherever she went. She walked out into the evening. The dining facility at FOB Sandridge was utilitarian in the extreme 3 folding tables, metal chairs, a serving line, managed by 2 support staff who worked with the resigned efficiency of people providing a service that nobody was effusive about. The food was good enough. The lighting was the particular fluorescent yellow that made everyone look slightly unwell. Claire went through the line at 17:52 hours. She chose a table in the far corner. This was not social strategy, it was habit. She had been choosing tables in far corners for most of her career because far corners gave her the ability to see the room and because they were usually empty and because she had learned to prefer her own company at the end of difficult days. She sat down. She ate. At 18:07 hours without announcement, a tray appeared across from her. She looked up. Rodriguez was standing on the other side of the table. I wasn't asking permission exactly, but he wasn't sitting down either. He was in that specific in-between position that asked a question without words. Claire looked at the tray. She looked at Rodriguez. Sit down, she said. He sat. He ate for approximately 45 seconds in silence. Then he said, I carried your rifle twice today. You did, she agreed. The second time you didn't argue. My shoulder hurt. Right. He turned his fork in his hand. The first time, coming off the mountain, I picked it up and I was thinking about the weight of it. Like actually thinking about it. How you climbed with that on your back. He paused. I've carried a lot of gear in my career. That rifle is heavy for anyone. It is, Claire said, and you climbed 3,000 meters with it. Approximately. In a sandstorm. The storm was worse on the way up, she said. By the summit it had. That's not my point, Rodriguez said. She looked at him. My point, he said, is that I made a joke about it weighing more than you. And I watched you carry it up a mountain and use it to save my life. And then I carried it back down and I thought, he stopped. I thought about my daughter. Claire set her fork down. She's 8, Rodriguez said. She's small for her age. She gets told that a lot teachers coaches kids in her class. You're too small for this. You're too small for that. He looked at Claire. I tell her it doesn't matter. That what matters is what you do. He paused. And then I show up to work and I do exactly what I tell her not to do. He met Claire's eyes. I'm sorry for that specifically. Not just the joke. That specifically. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Tell her, Claire said. Rodriguez frowned. Tell her what about today, Claire said. Tell her what happened. Tell her a woman who gets told she's too small showed up to a bomb and did it better than anyone expected. She picked her fork back up. Tell her that. Rodriguez stared at her. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I will. He ate. 2 minutes later, another tray appeared at the table. Torres sat down without ceremony. A minute after that, Marsh arrived and took the seat beside Rodriguez. Park sat down across from Marsh. Wickedman came last. He had 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Claire without asking the way you do with people you've decided to take care of without making it a production. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the table, all of them, filling in around her. Not above her, not at a careful social distance, but in the specific, ordinary way of people who have eaten too many meals at too many bases to be precious about proximity. She thought about the dining halls she had eaten in over the past 4 years. The ones where she had finished her food quickly and left before the spaces filled up. The ones where she had learned to be comfortable with her own company because other company had not been reliably available. She picked up the coffee. Nobody made a speech. Nobody said anything portentous. Rodriguez was telling Marsh something about the helicopter pilot's approach angle during the extraction. Torres was reading something on his phone. Park was eating with the focused attention of a man who takes food seriously. Whitman was looking at the table with the expression of someone who had stopped thinking about something difficult and had decided to be present instead. It was ordinary. That was the thing about it. It was completely mundanely, overwhelmingly ordinary. And Claire, who had spent 4 years learning to live without, it felt the weight of the ordinary, like something physical, not heavy but substantial, like a hand on her shoulder that was too careful to press on the injured one. She ate. At 18:39 hours, the door of the dining facility opened and Carter walked in. He went through the serving line without looking at the tables. He got his food. He turned. He looked at the table in the far corner. He looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. All the people around it, the tray in the middle that was Claire's, the coffee cup that Whitman had placed there. He walked over. He sat down at the head of the table. Nobody reacted with surprise. Nobody made a comment. Carter picked up his fork and said without preamble to Marsh, the secondary approach at the compound added 14 minutes to our timeline. I want to talk about whether there's a route modification that preserves the tactical advantage without the time cost. Marsh nodded and pulled out his phone where he had photographs of the approach. The conversation became a working conversation, partly mission analysis, partly planning, partly the ordinary talk of people who spend most of their lives in each other's company and have developed the rhythms of that company. Claire listened. She contributed when she had something to contribute. She was quiet when she didn't. Nobody told her she didn't belong at the table. Nobody moved around her instead of beside her. At 19:02 hours, Rodriguez reached across the table toward the small condiment tray in the center and looked at Claire. "Pass the salt," he said. She looked at him. Something passed across his face, a recognition, a flicker of awareness that those were the same words that had been used on the flight line in a different voice, with a different weight. She saw him realize it the moment after he said it. She saw him start to say something, to clarify, to correct, to explain that he hadn't meant. "Here," she said. She passed the salt. Rodriguez took it. He held her gaze for 1 second. She held his. Then she went back to her food. But something had happened in that exchange that both of them understood. Not an erasure of the morning, not a pretense that the flight line comment hadn't occurred, but something more honest than erasure. The same words in a different context with different meaning. Words that had once been intended to diminish, passed back and forth between people who had been through something together with no weight behind them, except the ordinary one. Whitman picked up his coffee. Over the rim of the cup, he looked at Claire. She looked back. He lowered the cup. "Good coffee," he said. "It's terrible coffee," she said. "Yeah," he agreed, "it really is." He drank it anyway. At 2014 hours, Carter left the dining facility first. He stopped at the door and looked back at the table one time. Most of the team was still there. No tactical reason, no scheduled activity, just people at a table at the end of a long day. He walked out. In the communications room 30 minutes later, a response had arrived from Squadron Command regarding the mission report Carter had filed. He sat at the communications terminal and read it. The response was from Colonel Harris, the squadron commanding officer. It was 4 paragraphs long and covered the expected items: mission success acknowledgement, HVT, custody confirmation, preliminary debrief scheduling. The 3rd paragraph noted the engaging statistics from Claire's mission report summary and requested a full data package, shot data, wind readings, thermal scope recordings. The 4th paragraph was 8 words. It said, "Who approved this specialist for this mission type?" Carter read those 8 words. He read them twice. Then he typed his response. He wrote, "I approved Specialist Bennett. That decision stands. Full data package to follow." He sent it. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he thought about Colonel Harris reading that response. He thought about what would happen next, the formal review that he had mentioned to Claire, the attention that would arrive from the shot data, the conversation that would happen at levels above his that he couldn't fully predict or control. He thought about Claire in the dining facility with people around her instead of apart from her. He thought about her saying, "I was afraid the whole time. I just don't let it make decisions." I thought about 15 years of missions and the things he had been wrong about and the things he had been right about, and the particular category of wrong that cost something important, not lives today, but something else. The way a team sees itself, the way assumptions calcify into policy without anyone deciding they should. He typed one more message to Squadron. It was addressed directly to Colonel Harris, and it was longer than the first response. It outlined in precise military language the full scope of Claire's actions, the pre-mission assessment, the formation, departure decision, the summit engagement, the close-range defense, the North Ridge engagement. It outlined the shoulder injury and the corticosteroid injection and the fact that she had continued operating effectively through both. At the end, he wrote, "Specialist Bennett's performance on this mission exceeded the standard for any personnel in this unit. Recommend formal commendation review and continued assignment to special operations support roles at her request." He sent it. He turned off the terminal. Outside the communications room, the desert at night was cool and completely quiet. The stars were back. The sandstorm had taken them for most of the day, and now they were returned sharp and dense, the way they only appear in places far from artificial light. Carter stood outside for a moment. I thought about the morning, the flight line, the transport ramp, dropping the laughter. He thought about the operations tent and the map and the 14-hour satellite window. He thought about what he had said, "You are not built for this mission." He thought about the tire tracks in the photograph that he had looked at and not seen. He thought about 3,050 meters through a sandstorm. I thought about a woman on a summit alone, with no backup and no permission, making a decision that his regulation and his order had told her not to make, and making it correctly. He went back inside. In the medical tent, Diaz was finishing his evening check of the small supply inventory when the door opened and Claire walked in. He looked at her. She was moving more carefully than she had been earlier. The corticosteroid was wearing off on schedule, which meant the shoulder was beginning to reintroduce itself at its actual volume. "Sit down," he said. She sat. I examined the shoulder without talking for a few minutes. The compression wrap was holding well. The joint was swollen but structurally intact. He added cold therapy and adjusted the wrap and said things about overnight management that she listened to with genuine attention this time, instead of the selective attention she had applied earlier. When he was done, she sat still for a moment. "Diaz," she said, "specialist. The corticosteroid this morning." She looked at him. "You didn't have to give it to me." Diaz was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, I didn't." He put his supplies away. "You want to know why I did?" "Yes." He turned and looked at her. "Because I saw the mission report from the canyon come through on the communications board at 12:15. The numbers," he paused. "I've patched up a lot of people on this base. I know what they can do. When I saw those numbers, I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought that whatever she needs to keep doing what she does, I'm going to make sure she has it." He held her gaze. "That's why." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Rest a shoulder. Those are my terms." She almost smiled. "1 week." "2," he said firmly. "Non-negotiable." 10 days, she said. He looked at the ceiling. "You're going to be a problem for the rest of your career, aren't you?" "People keep telling me that," she said. She got up, moving carefully, and walked toward the tent entrance. At the door, she stopped. "Diaz," she said without turning around. "Yeah, it's going to hurt tonight. I told you that this morning." "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to know I was listening." She walked out. The base was quiet now. Most personnel were in their assigned quarters. The night rotation had taken over the perimeter. The desert that had tried very hard today to make this go differently was settled and dark and giving nothing away. Claire walked to her quarters, a small partitioned section of a larger tent, a cot, a footlocker, and her equipment. She set the Ch-tac against the wall where she could reach it. She sat on the cot. She went through the routine of someone who has learned to prepare for the next day before the current day fully ends. Equipment checks, mental review of the day's engagements. The quiet accounting that a sniper does to understand what worked and what needed adjustment. She thought about the summit. She thought about the shot. She thought about the moment between the trigger pull and the impact, those 3.5 seconds when the bullet was in the air. And she didn't know yet when everything she had calculated either was right or wasn't, when the Desert Storm was doing whatever it was going to do, and she was doing what she could. She thought about the word they had used on the flight line, doll. She thought about it without anger. That was the thing people didn't understand. She didn't carry the anger. The anger was a weight, and she had learned a long time ago that she was carrying enough already. What she carried instead was something more useful. The memory of every room where someone had decided what she was before she had the chance to show them. The memory of every qualification she had passed that someone had expected her to fail. The memory of every target at every impossible range in every training exercise where the rifle had done exactly what she asked it to do, because the rifle, as Corporal Reeves had told her, did not care about anything except whether she was right. She had been right. The shoulder throbbed. She lay down on the cot and stared at the tent ceiling and thought about Rodriguez's daughter, 8 years old and small for her age, and being told by teachers and coaches and kids in her class that size was a limitation. She thought about what it would mean for that girl to hear this story. She thought about Carter's face in the operations tent and Carter's face on the summit and Carter's face at the dining table. 3 different faces from one person across one day, each one more honest than the last. She thought about the coffee Whitman had put in front of her without asking. She thought about Torres calling her position at the North Ridge. She thought about Diaz and the corticosteroid and the compression wrap in 10 days. She thought about the satellite photograph in the tire tracks in the 14-hour window. She thought about what Marsh had said in the debrief: "We almost died because of what she looks like. And we didn't because of what she is." The shoulder hurt. She closed her eyes. Outside, the desert was very quiet. Tomorrow, Squadron Command would begin their formal review. There would be questions and data requests in the particular machinery of military documentation that followed any engagement that exceeded normal parameters. There would be conversations at levels above Carter and above his squadron that she couldn't predict or control. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was a cot and a rifle against the wall and a shoulder that was exactly as painful as Diaz had promised. And somewhere in the dining facility, which was empty now but still held the shape of what had happened there this evening, a table in the far corner that had been full. Claire was asleep by 2047 hours. She slept without difficulty. That was the other thing nobody told you about the kind of day she had just had, that when you have spent every ounce of yourself in the right direction, when the fear has been used rather than surrendered to, when the distance between who you are and what you've done has been closed completely, the night comes easily. She slept. The desert held its breath. And somewhere across the base in the communications room, Colonel Harris was reading Carter's second message for the third time. The one about the commendation, the one about continued assignment, the one that said what she was and what she had done in the precise, unembellished language of a man who had spent 15 years saying exactly what he meant. Harris read it. He picked up his pen. He began to write. Colonel Harris arrived at FOB Sandridge at 0847 hours the following morning. Nobody had been told he was coming. That was the first sign that something significant was happening. Colonels who conducted routine debrief reviews sent advance notice. Colonels who flew out personally to a forward operating base less than 18 hours after receiving a mission report did not send advance notice because advance notice gave people time to prepare. And a colonel who moved that fast was not interested in prepared. Carter was briefed on the incoming aircraft at 0831 hours. He had time to change into a clean uniform and nothing else. He was standing at the landing area when the command helicopter touched down, and he had the expression of a man who was certain he understood why this was happening and was not entirely certain how it was going to go. Harris stepped off the helicopter alone. He was 53 years old, compact and precise in the way of men who had spent decades in environments that rewarded efficiency, with gray at his temples and eyes that moved across a situation, the way experienced eyes do, quickly cataloging, returning to the things that mattered. He shook Carter's hand. "Where is she?" he said. Not hello, not good morning. Where is she? Carter said, "Medical tent, sir, shoulder follow-up." Harris walked. In the medical tent, Diaz was unwrapping and re-examining Claire's shoulder when the tent flap opened. Diaz looked up. His expression shifted from clinical to alert in the specific way of military medical personnel when rank enters a room unexpectedly. Claire was sitting on the cot with her left arm extended. She turned her head when Diaz's expression changed. She saw Harris. She moved to stand. "Don't get up," Harris said. He pulled a folding chair from against the tent wall, opened it, and sat down across from her with the matter-of-fact movement of someone who had long ago stopped being theatrical about rank. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at her face. He looked at Diaz. "How bad?" he said. "Grade 2 strain," Diaz said. "Aggravated by sustained operation with compromised joint integrity. She needs 10 days of restricted activity. She negotiate you down from 2 weeks. Diaz paused. "Yes, sir." Harris looked at Claire. "You're Specialist Bennett." "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment. Not the way Carter had studied her in the operations tent, not with the calculation of someone deciding whether she measured up. More the way a person looks at something they have heard described and are now seeing for the first time, checking the description against the reality. "I've been doing this for 28 years, Harris said. "I've read a lot of mission reports." He paused. "I read Lieutenant Carter's report 3 times last night." Claire said nothing. The first time Harris said, "I thought the numbers were wrong, a transcription error or a reporting inconsistency." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "The second time I checked the supporting data. Wine reading thermals, OGS, the shot data Carter attached." He paused again. "The third time I read it because I needed to understand something." "Sir," Claire said. "I needed to understand," Harris said, "how a specialist who was assigned to a mission as a secondary support asset ended up being the primary reason 12 operators are eating breakfast this morning instead of being in body bags." He held her gaze. "So I'm here, and I want you to tell me in your words what happened yesterday." "It was 09:03 hours, Claire told him. "She did it the way she did everything, without decoration, without false modesty, without the kind of narrative shaping that people apply to stories when they want to look a specific way. She walked him through the aerial photograph and the tire tracks. She walked him through the conversation with Carter in the operations tent. She walked him through the decision at the motor pool and the climb and the summit and the shots. She told him about the close-range engagement on the eastern face and the sidearm. She told him about the North Ridge in the afternoon and the 7 rounds with a compromised shoulder. She said all of it in approximately 14 minutes, and Harris listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the tent was quiet except for the sound of the desert outside. Harris looked at his hands, then he looked at her. In the report, he said Carter noted that he dismissed your assessment of the canyon approach. Yes, sir. He also noted the unauthorized formation departure. Yes, sir. Harris was quiet for a moment. You understand that I'm obligated to address the formation departure. I understand, sir. A specialist departing assigned in formation during an active mission is a significant disciplinary matter. Yes, sir. Regardless of outcome. I understand that, sir. Harris looked at her steadily. So let me ask you directly. If you had the same information, the same assessment, the same conversation with Lieutenant Carter, if everything was identical and you knew then what the outcome would be, would you make the same decision? The question sat in the air between them. Claire didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know the answer, but because Harris had asked it seriously and it deserved a serious response. Yes, sir, she said. I would, without hesitation. With the same 22 minutes of deliberation, she said, and the same conclusion. Harris looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. Goodwood, he said. She went very still. An operator who would make a different decision when the outcome is known than when it isn't, Harris said, is an operator making decisions based on results rather than analysis. That's not tactical thinking, that's backward. He sat back in his chair. You made your decision based on what you assessed. Your assessment was correct. The decision was correct. He paused. The formation departure is a paperwork problem. I'll handle the paperwork problem. Claire looked at him. Sir, she said carefully, the regulation exists to prevent individuals from making poor unilateral decisions that endanger the mission, Harris said. You made a correct unilateral decision that saved the mission. He met her eyes. Regulations are tools. The question is always whether the tool was applied correctly. In this case, the spirit of the regulation mission, Success Force Protection, was served by your decision, not violated by it. He stood from the chair. That's my assessment, and I outranked the regulation. He almost smiled when he said that last part. Almost? He turned to Diaz. She gets the 10 days she negotiated. Yes, sir. He turned back to Claire. After that, I want a meeting. You, me, Carter, and someone from Naval Special Warfare Command who is very interested in talking to you. Claire frowned slightly. May I ask why, sir? Because what you did yesterday at 3,050 meters in a sandstorm is going to require a formal documentation process, Harris said. And because there are people in this command who have been asking questions about the integration of specialized sniper assets into special operations units, and you have just provided a data point that is going to significantly influence that conversation. He looked at her one more time, the look of a man filing something away carefully. Rest your shoulder, specialist, he said. He walked out. Diaz stood very still for a moment after Harris left. Then he finished wrapping Claire's shoulder in silence. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at her. Naval Special Warfare Command, he said. Yes, Claire said. That's not a routine follow-up meeting. No, she agreed. Diaz looked at the tent entrance where Harris had exited. He flew out here personally, 18 hours after the mission. Yes, because of your report. Carter's report, Claire corrected. Diaz shook his head slowly. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. 10 days, he said finally. Seriously this time. Full 10 days. 10 days, she agreed. She stood. She moved toward the tent entrance. At the door, she paused. Diaz, she said, thank you, again. Stop thanking me, he said. It makes me feel like I did something extraordinary. I wrapped a shoulder. You did it well, she said. Everyone does something well, he said. That's the whole point, isn't it? She looked at him. He shrugged. Go rest. She walked out into the morning. Harris spent 3 hours at FOB Sandridge. He debriefed Carter privately for 45 minutes. He reviewed the mission data package. He walked the North Ridge perimeter, the lower section, not the summit, and stood for a while looking at the angle and the distance and the terrain, the way a person does when they are trying to make something abstract into something concrete. Carter walked with him. They didn't talk much during the ridge walk. Harris asked 3 technical questions about the defensive engagement the previous afternoon. Carter answered them. The rest of the time, they walked in the particular silence of 2 people who have already said the significant things and are now simply occupying the same space while they process them. At one point, Harris stopped and looked toward the north summit. The actual summit, 3,000 meters of climbing distance from the canyon floor, visible from where they stood as a distant, sharp edge against the blue morning sky. "She climbed that," Harris said. "Not a question." "Alone," Carter confirmed, "before sunrise, with the rifle." Harris looked at the summit for a long moment. "I asked Carter to write the commendation recommendation personally," Harris said to nobody in particular. "I want his language, not mine. He was here. He saw it." He turned away from the summit. A commendation written by someone who was present means something different than one written from a report. Carter said, "I'll have it to you by end of week." "Tomorrow," Harris said. Carter looked at him. "Tomorrow," Harris said again. "This doesn't wait." He walked back toward the fob. At 1:34 hours, Harris's helicopter lifted off. Carter watched it go. When it was no longer visible, he turned back to the base and stood outside the operations tent for a moment, doing the internal accounting that comes after a significant conversation with a superior officer. The accounting was more complicated than usual because the conversation had not gone the way he had expected. He had expected questions about the formation, departure-pointed, formal questions with regulatory citations. He had expected to defend his mission report, his attribution, his characterization of Claire's actions. He had expected to spend 45 minutes justifying a document that he had written in the conviction that it was accurate and right. Instead, Harris had spent most of their conversation asking about the integration question, how specialized sniper assets were currently used, where the gaps were, what this mission revealed about capability that wasn't being fully utilized. And he had asked at one point a question that Carter was still turning over. He had asked, "In 15 years, has anyone ever performed at that level in a first mission with your unit?" Carter had thought about it honestly. He had gone through faces and names and operations in his mind, moving quickly through the record of his career. "No," he had said. "Has anyone performed at that level in any mission with your unit?" Carter had thought about it again. He had said no. Harris had nodded, not with satisfaction, with something more like resolution, the expression of a man who has confirmed something he needed confirmed before he could move forward. "Then we need to talk about what we've been missing," Harris had said. Carter was thinking about that now outside the operations tent. What we've been missing, not what she is, what we've been missing. He went inside. By midday, something had happened at FOB Sandstorm that had no official name and no documented origin. It was the kind of thing that happens in enclosed communities when a shared experience has permanently altered the way the community understands itself. The SEAL team moved differently around Claire. Not with deference exactly, not the walking on eggshells quality of people who are afraid of saying the wrong thing. More like the natural adjustment that occurs when the geometry of a group shifts. When someone who was on the periphery moves to the center, the people who were at the center don't disappear. They reorganize. Rodriguez had stopped at her quarters that morning with coffee and the information that Harris had arrived, which she had already known, and the information that the team was running a non-operational physical training session at 1,000 hours, in case she wanted to observe, which was his way of saying, come be around people without having to do anything that would compromise the shoulder. She had gone. She sat on a gear crate at the edge of the training area and watched 11 men run through drills in the desert heat. Torres had stopped beside her at one point and said without preamble, "If I ask you to talk through the summit engagement, the technical elements, would that be appropriate?" She had looked at him. "Training context. I want to understand the wind reading at intermediate range," he said. "How you estimated it through the storm. I've been trying to work it out from the data, and I can't reconstruct your method." "Sit down," she said. He sat. She talked him through it. He asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and she answered each one with the same precision she applied to everything. At one point, Whitman drifted over during a rest interval and sat on the other side, listening without joining the conversation. After a few minutes, he said, "Can I ask something?" She looked at him. The Eastern face, the third fighter. Close-range moving target sidearm. He paused. What were you thinking at that moment? Not tactically. What was in your head? She thought about the question. She thought about the fraction of a second before she had drawn the sidearm, the moment of absolute clarity when the situation simplified itself down to its essential components. I was thinking, she said slowly, that the Chaytak was too much rifle for 38 meters and that I was annoyed about the angle. Whitman stared at her. Torres looked at her. Annoyed, Whitman said. Nansen. The angle was bad, she said. If he had come over the ridge 2 meters to the left, I would have had a cleaner approach. A beat of silence. Then Whitman made a sound that started as something else and finished as a laugh. Not the mocking laughter from the flight line. Something completely different. The laugh of a person who has been shown something that is both impressive and absurdly humanly real. Annoyed, he said again, still laughing. It was a bad angle, she said, and something in her voice had the faint, dry quality of someone who was aware of being funny and was choosing not to prevent it. Torres was laughing now, too. She let them laugh. She looked out at the desert. She thought about the bad angle, and she thought about the shot, and she thought about the fact that the shot had worked in spite of the angle, and she thought that annoyance properly managed was as good a motivator as anything else she had encountered in 29 years of living. At 1500 hours, Carter called her to the operations tent. She came alone. I was sitting at the mission planning table, not standing over it, but sitting at it, which was different. The maps were gone. In their place was a single folder and a legal pad with handwriting on it. Sit down, he said. She sat across from him. I'm writing your commendation, he said. Harris wants it tomorrow. I have most of it. There's one part I want to get right, and I want your help getting it right. She looked at him. Sir, the commendation is your document. The facts are my document, Carter said. The meaning is what I'm working on. He looked at the legal pad. I know how to document what you did. I can describe the engagement, the distances, the conditions, the outcome. That's straightforward. He paused. What I'm trying to document is why it matters beyond this mission. Why what happened here, it is something that needs to be said out loud, in formal language, in a document that will be read by people who weren't here. Claire was quiet. So tell me, Carter said, in your words, why does it matter? She thought about it for longer than she usually thought before speaking. The afternoon light was moving across the tent. Outside, she could hear the base going about its work, the sounds of people and equipment, and the ordinary machinery of a military operation. Because the next time, she said finally, someone who looks like me shows up at a forward base and steps off a transport carrying a rifle that people think is too heavy for them, there will be a document. She met his eyes. A real document, with real numbers. That says what happened when someone like me was given the chance to do the job. She paused. The commendation isn't for me, it's for her. The next one. Carter looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his pen. He wrote for approximately 30 seconds without stopping. Then he looked up. That's in the document, he said. She nodded. He closed the folder. 10 days, he said. Rest the shoulder. After that, Harris wants the meeting. I know. Naval Special Warfare Command. I know. He looked at her. You're not nervous about that. It wasn't a question. Should I be, she said. He thought about it. No, he said. I don't think you should. She stood. She was almost at the tent entrance when Carter said Bennett. She stopped. I owe you something I haven't said directly yet. She turned. He was still sitting at the table. The legal pad in front of him, the folder, the pen. The operations tent that had been the site of the first conversation, the dismissal, the map, and the tire tracks in the 14-hour window. Thank you, Carter said. For my team, for the 12 of them. He held her gaze. And for doing it the way you did it. Not to prove something, not to make a point. Just because it was the right thing to do. Claire stood in the tent entrance. She thought about the motor pool 22 minutes on a gear crate, the calculation she had made between following an order and following what she knew. She thought about Corporal Reeves and the rifle and what it cared about. She thought about 9 shots at 3,050 meters and a sandstorm that hadn't cared either. That's the only way I know how to do it, sir, she said. She walked out. The remaining 9 days of restricted activity passed with the particular texture of time spent in a place where everything around you is in motion while you are required to be still. Claire attended briefings as an observer. She assisted Torres with the technical documentation of the summit engagement, which had become a training reference document that Torres was apparently serious about completing thoroughly. She ate meals at the corner table that was no longer only hers. On the fourth day, Rodriguez showed her a photograph on his phone. His daughter, 8 years old, dark hair, small for her age, standing on a soccer field, in a too large jersey, grinning at the camera, with the specific confidence of a child who doesn't know yet that the world sometimes tries to take that confidence away. "I called her last night," Rodriguez said. "Told her about you." He looked at the photograph. "She asked if you were real." "What did you tell her?" Claire asked. "I told her you were the realest person I'd ever met," Rodriguez said. He put the phone away. Neither of them said anything else. On the seventh day, Whitman found Claire sitting outside during the early morning before the base had fully woken up, looking at the north summit in the distance. He sat beside her without asking. They were quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say something." "Say it," she said. "I've been in this unit for 6 years," Whitman said. "I've never doubted my own judgment about people. I thought I was good at it. Reading people." He paused. "I was wrong about you in about 30 seconds. The moment you came off that aircraft. You were going by what you saw," she said. "That's the problem," he said. "I should know better than that. In this job, the guy who looks the most dangerous isn't always the one you have to worry about. The situation that looks controlled isn't always controlled." He looked at his hands. "I apply that to every operational context I'm in. Everyone. Except apparently when a woman steps off a transport and she's not as big as I expected." Claire looked at the summit. "The mascot comment," she said. "Yeah. You said it to make someone laugh," she said. "Not because you genuinely believed it. There's a difference." Whitman frowned. "Does that make it better?" "No," she said, "but it makes it more fixable." She turned to look at him. "A person who says something because they think it's true is harder to change than a person who says something because the room expected them to." Whitman was quiet for a moment. "You think about people a lot," he said. "Why they do things." "I think about trajectories," she said. "In the field and everywhere else." She looked back at the summit. "If you understand why something is moving in a direction, you can predict where it's going." He looked at her profile. "And where am I going?" he said. She almost smiled. "Somewhere better than where you started," she said. "That much is clear." He nodded slowly. They sat in the morning, quiet for a while longer, and then the base began to wake around them, and the day had to be lived, and they went to live it. On the 10th day, the shoulder was significantly improved, not perfect. Diaz ran a full assessment and graded it at approximately 75% functional range with strength limitations. He cleared her for light operational activity with restrictions and scheduled a follow-up for the following week. She thanked him. He told her to stop thanking him. She thanked him again. He looked at the ceiling. She walked out. The meeting with Naval Special Warfare Command happened at 1400 hours on the 11th day via secure video link because the command representative, a captain named Whitfield, was in Virginia. Harris was on the call. Carter was on the call. Claire sat in the communications room in a chair that Whitman had adjusted to the right height without being asked and without saying anything about it. Whitfield was 50 years old and had the bearing of someone who had been navigating military institutions for long enough to understand that the institution was a vehicle and the vehicle needed fuel, and sometimes the fuel came from unexpected places. He looked at Claire on the screen. "Specialist Bennett," he said, "I've reviewed the mission report, the shot data, the engagement timeline, and the commendations submitted by Lieutenant Carter." He paused. "I have one question before we discuss the formal proposal." "Sir," Claire said. "In your assessment," Whitfield said, "was what you did on the summit replicable by you specifically, not as a one-time event? The question had weight behind it, not personal weight, professional weight, the weight of someone who was deciding whether what had happened was a remarkable accident or a reliable capability." "Yes, sir," she said, "under similar conditions." "Under similar or worse conditions," she said. "Conditions are variables. The fundamentals don't change with conditions." Whitfield looked at her for 3 seconds. "The proposal," he said, "is to formalize a specialized long-range support role for integration with special operations units. Not a generic role, a designed role built around demonstrated capability." He paused. "Your demonstrated capability is the starting point." The room was very quiet. "This would require your agreement," Whitfield continued. It's not an assignment, it's an offer. The role would be developed in consultation with the operators who work alongside it. It would carry appropriate rank advancement. It would be documented, formal, and permanent. Claire sat very still. She thought about the transport aircraft and the flight line and the laughter. She thought about the operations tent and the map and the words, "You are not built for this mission." She thought about 22 minutes on a gear crate and the decision that nobody had wanted her to make. She thought about 9 shots in 3.5 seconds and a bullet traveling through a sandstorm toward a target that she had calculated with everything she knew. Everything she had spent a career building in rooms where most people hadn't expected her to walk out standing. She thought about Rodriguez's daughter on the soccer field. She thought about the next one. "Yes, sir," she said. "I agree." Whitfield nodded once. He looked at Harris. Harris looked at Carter. Carter looked at Claire. Nobody said anything pretentious. Nobody made a speech. The agreement was made the way the most permanent things are made, quietly, directly between people who understood what they were agreeing to without needing to perform it. The call ended at 14:47 hours. Harris left the communications room first with a nod in Claire's direction that carried more than a nod usually carries. Carter was next. He stopped at the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said Corporal Reeves was right. She understood immediately. "About the rifle." "About all of it," Carter said. He walked out. Claire sat alone in the communications room for a moment. The screen in front of her was dark. The base was doing its afternoon work outside. Somewhere across the facility, she could hear Rodriguez and Torres in what sounded like an argument about something operational and probably unnecessary. Ordinary sounds. She stood. She picked up her rifle from where it leaned against the wall. 31 pounds. She held it the way she always held it, not as a burden, not as a symbol, but as exactly what it was, a tool she had mastered, a responsibility she had chosen. An instrument that had never once asked anything about the person holding it except whether that person was right. She had been right. The world did not transform itself to acknowledge that. There was no ceremony, no moment of revelation, no crowd that parted. The desert outside was still the desert. The base was still the base. The shoulder still ached in the specific way Diaz had predicted it would ache and scheduled follow-ups for. But something had changed in the architecture of things, in the formal documents that now carried her name in the role that was being built, because of what she had done in the 12 men who ate beside her at dinner, instead of around her in the little girl in the too large soccer jersey, who would hear a story from her father about a woman who had been told she was too small and had shown up anyway. Claire walked out of the communications room. She walked through the base. She passed the spot where the transport had parked 11 days ago. She looked at the flight line empty now in the afternoon heat. She thought about stepping off that aircraft. She thought about the laughter. She thought about studying the map while the laughter was still in the air around her, because the map was what mattered and the laughter was noise, and she had learned a long time ago the difference between the two. The rifle was in her hand. The shoulder would heal. The road ahead was longer than the one behind and harder in ways she couldn't fully predict yet, and she was 4 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 112 pounds with her gear on, and none of that, not one single element of that, was ever going to change what she was. She had proven on a summit nobody believed she could reach in a storm that made the shot nearly impossible. That courage did not come from fighting, and certainty did not come from comfort, and the most dangerous person on any battlefield was not always the one who looked dangerous from a flight line. Sometimes it was the one carrying a rifle that was too heavy, walking toward the map, already seeing what everyone else had missed.